Mel, do you want to go? Okay, so I wanted to welcome everybody to the session today. I think it's really important that we're coming together for this, and thank you all for taking some time of your busy schedules to being here. We're very excited about it. My name is Tomas Peseggi, and for the ones of you I haven't met, I'm the chair of Neighbourhood Centre Queensland. I have been for a couple of years, and I'm coming to you from Gabi country. I'm on Kalandra, in the area of Kalandra, and I coordinate the Baringa Community Centre. So as always, really important in this work, for me as a migrant and a settler of this country, and in the spirit of conciliation, to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands in which we meet and the places of where we all live and work, and hopefully attempt in our various ways to contribute to a much better place. So thank you all for coming. Welcome to you. And also, if there's anyone in the room who is from an Indigenous background, special acknowledgement to you. Just how the session is going to run, Em will do a little bit of a background around the sector impact report. There we go. Then Chris is going to take us through the hard data and the findings, and then we do have some time for Q&A set aside. So if you have any questions or any comments, sort of save them from there, and then we'll have an opportunity for that. And then we will officially launch the report. So we want it to be super quick and a little bit of interactive there as well. Thank you so much, Louise, for telling us where you're coming from. So obviously around Brisbane, Turrbal and Yagara people on the chat. If anyone wants to share where they're coming from in the chat and place their traditional name, that'll be great to give us a sense of where we're all coming from. So Em, I'll hand over to you to do the context of the report.
Hi everyone, it's so good to see you all here. As many of you know, and I think many of you have participated in this survey, but we just wanted to recap around the goals and objectives of the survey, and also to acknowledge Neighbourhood Houses Victoria, who have given us a really big hand in really getting us off and running. So the first sector impact survey was conducted in 2020, and obviously a lot has changed since then. And so this report is aiming to track change over time. Sorry, my slide has disappeared. Aiming to track changes over time. Sorry, I'm just finding my spot on the slide. So that we can track impact and track kind of getting that snapshot across the sector. So as you know, until we started doing this work, there hasn't been a really comprehensive snapshot data of neighbourhood centres across the state, who we are, what we do, what our similarities are, our different types of funding, all of these different components that make up a really diverse and amazing network. And so a core part of this is really wanting to develop that data and make really clear and comprehensive information freely available that really clearly communicates the value and the impact of our sector, so that we can use that to communicate with a whole bunch of stakeholders, both at the state level, and it also feeds into the national level data that's being collected across Australia as well. So that influencing policy and building our recognition and profile across Australia. And at the moment, we are using that data really heavily in our current budget campaign and cycle. So we're bringing this data to our meetings with ministers and members of parliament who we've been meeting over the past few weeks, with many more to come. And again, they're very keen to hear more about the sector impact report and the data that we have as a tool that can really influence some of the policy outcomes, we hope. Well, that's the goal. And as well as at the local neighbourhood centre level, we know that everyone wants to know that they're doing good work, and that can be really hard to determine at that local level with the cost of evaluation. So this is one fairly affordable and accessible way that we can create the individual community value of each centre, while noting that no quantitative data is ever going to fully capture the just those real community human essence of neighbourhood centres and the work that happens there. But at the same time, the more that we have that overall snapshot of the work that we do, that we can bring to funding bodies, that we can take to our meetings with MPs, that you can attach to grant applications and annual reports, as I know some people in this room have done with the last report. Just trying to find easy ways to really highlight the work of individual centres and celebrate the work that you do and be able to track that over time as well. So with no further ado, I will hand over to Chris to talk through some of the findings of this year's, well, for their 2021 financial year data.
You're on mute, Chris.
Apologies. I was just saying that the core statistics that we gather through the annual survey has really been determined by Neighbourhood Houses Victoria. I think if we were going to go into details on like every possible program a neighbourhood centre runs, we could have a million different SROIs and community values. But we really wanted to concentrate on just some of the core activities of neighbourhood centres, both at a state level, and also this is something that we're looking at a national level as well. So I just wanted to share some of the overall survey results that we found for the last financial year for 2020. So first off, a little bit about the participants of the survey. So overall, we determined that there was 127 programs that were funded by the Department of Communities, and there were around about 17 centres that are operating unfunded without department funding. We know there's actually a lot more than 17 centres. There's a lot of centres that NCQ doesn't have a relationship with, but 17, we're fairly sure that we could include them in the data that we gathered. And this year we had 76 fully completed surveys and 7 partially completed surveys. So that's an increase from last year. We only had 64 responses last year. And we had 7 partial completed surveys last year and 7 partially completed surveys this year. It's good to include some partial data as well, because some of that can be used in determining what medians are for different demographics. And as you see there, what we do to try and get an estimate of the entire sector in Queensland is that we survey a group of neighbourhood centres. We categorise them according to their population type. We find out the medians of some of their results, and then we assume that those who don't participate in the survey perform at those medians. And we're able to come up with a rough overall snapshot of the output of neighbourhood centres. 63% of neighbourhood centres are located outside of metropolitan areas. So when we start to think of what does a typical neighbourhood centre look like, the majority are outside of major cities. A bit of a look at number of people who participated in neighbourhood centres over the 2021 period. We can see the medians for each neighbourhood centre across the top there. So for the metropolitan areas, roughly 230 people visit each neighbourhood centre. Rural 196, rural 3,000 to 10,150, and the smallest rural communities 113. And when we stretch that out to the entire sector, around about 1.6 million people visited neighbourhood centres in that time period. This is about 200,000 people less than the year before. And naturally, we kind of expect that would happen because we did our data gathering within COVID-19 restrictions. And of course, there would be less people physically visiting neighbourhood centres. But what we found that even though people could not physically visit their neighbourhood centre, they could still interact with them over the phone, online, that sort of thing. So we had an extrapolated value of 2.3 million interactions with neighbourhood centres. Participants in program activities, 956,100. This figure is particularly relevant in the context of the parliamentary inquiry, because we know from some of the data that's been gathered from Victoria that people who are involved in programmed activities in neighbourhood centres get a higher social connection than those who just visit once off and things like that. And so that's how we determine some increased quality of life outcomes that we're able to assign a dollar value to. And participant referrals to other services, around about 290,000 extrapolated over the entire year. These figures were compared with a snapshot survey that the department did last year of around about 45 neighbourhood centres, and we found that that our data and their data were roughly the same, so that proves we've got a fairly robust methodology if both techniques kind of marry up with the same figures. We also gathered some data on the types of services that neighbourhood centres offer, and there's a massive big list of them. Obviously, 92% are on top at referring and 90% offer room hire, but we had a look at some new services this year. There was family support services, a bit of a typo in support there. 58% of neighbourhood centres were involved in family support services, and I think this is particularly a historical thing in Queensland. Family support and neighbourhood centres worked side by side over a long time in Queensland, hence our previous names, including family support, previous names of NCQ, counselling psychology, 53%. So a lot of neighbourhood centres are offering low-cost counselling and psychology services. 35% homelessness services, legal services 22%, and housing, rental and homestay services 21%. Two areas that I noticed a big increase in the services that neighbourhood centres were offering. One was around domestic and family violence. So that grew from the last survey from 26% up to 38% of neighbourhood centres offering domestic and family violence services of some sort. And we know from some of the other research that domestic violence has increased considerably during COVID, and neighbourhood centres are really stepping into that space, because we know that there's a lot of specialised services that are on either non-existent in some communities or are so overwhelmed that there's quite a long waiting list. So neighbourhood centres are actually holding those domestic and family violence clients until they can get seen by a specialised service. We also saw a massive increase in food security, long-term food security activities undertaken by neighbourhood centres, rising from 6% all the way up to 34%. And again, these figures are probably impacted by COVID. So speaking of COVID, we actually gathered some extra information about what neighbourhood centres were doing in the COVID space. So we found high numbers of neighbourhood centres were making phone calls, contacting vulnerable community members, linking people to official COVID-19 information and advice. We find that neighbourhood centres are often doing these things in the disaster space as well, in natural disasters. So in addition to this COVID information, we gathered some disaster information on what neighbourhood centres are doing in that space. And a lot more of that data will be in our statewide disaster strategy for neighbourhood centres that'll be released a bit later this year. But obviously food relief is up pretty high as well, at 78% of neighbourhood centres were involved in offering food relief during COVID. We also gathered some qualitative data on what neighbourhood centres were saying about their local communities, and also about themselves too. During the COVID period, they found that community members were dealing with a lot of social isolation, loneliness, which ties into the social isolation and loneliness report, and also an increase in housing issues as well. And while all this was happening, neighbourhood centres were dealing with their own struggles as well during COVID. Some lost volunteers who are in vulnerable age groups. There was reduced room hire, which affected the income levels of neighbourhood centres as well. So it's pretty impressive they are able to support others while going through a rough time themselves. We also had a bit more of an in-depth look at what neighbourhood centres were doing in terms of emergency relief. Emergency relief seems to be very much a focus in Queensland neighbourhood centres. And we found that with the first survey that we did, that our emergency relief levels were so much higher than down south in Victoria. We found that majority of neighbourhood centres were sourcing emergency relief from the local community or businesses. When it comes to federal funding, around 27% of neighbourhood centres were getting federal emergency relief funding and 27% were getting state emergency relief funding. And some of the previous research that I've done in that area is that there are some neighbourhood centres that get both federal and state emergency relief funding. Some get one or the other. Federal emergency relief funding is more highly funded, and state emergency relief funding is more lower funded. But we found neighbourhood centres were giving out a huge amount of emergency relief, obviously, tied with the COVID epidemic. So 680 tonnes of food we estimated were giving out by neighbourhood centres, 137,000 frozen meals, 2.8 million in other non-food material relief. And we found that 74% of neighbourhood centres were delivering emergency relief. So that's an increase of 4% from the last survey that was done. So more neighbourhood centres are delivering emergency relief and delivering higher amounts of emergency relief as well. I think when I looked at the median kilograms of food per neighbourhood centre, it jumped from 100 kilograms per month in the 2020 survey, and it's doubled since then over last year. A little bit about the community groups that have been using neighbourhood centre facilities. So there's been a slight drop in community groups actually using neighbourhood centres, and that's totally understandable during COVID restrictions, that neighbourhood centres had less opportunity to rent out their rooms to community groups. But what we found that was compensated by neighbourhood centres actually supporting community groups externally in the community. Number of hours the facilities were used were less, obviously because of COVID, but there was an increase in the number of community projects that neighbourhood centres ran. So it seems like, that it kind of demonstrates the adaptability of neighbourhood centres, I think, that if they're not able to support community groups from within their premises, then they actually go out externally and support the local community. We calculated that there were 2,745 volunteers per week in neighbourhood centres across the state, offering 703,000 hours per year. And that's an average of 19 per centre per week. That average is actually the same as our last survey, but I think the reason why we have more volunteers than the year before is because we have a few extra neighbourhood centres that we've added to our list. But it seems clear that they are offering more hours per year. And I think what we saw during COVID is that even though some neighbourhood centres lost a demographic of volunteers, there are other people in the community that started putting up their hand through the Care Army and some of those other initiatives and said, we'll help out. A little bit about neighbourhood centre resourcing. So in our first survey, the department funded 124 neighbourhood centres, and now it's 127. So there's been a couple of extra neighbourhood centres and departments funded, one in Thursday Island, Cannon Hill Neighbourhood Centre, Kalanga Community Centre as well. Average funding per centre really hasn't increased over the past couple of years. Medium amounts haven't increased much. The funding range, so neighbourhood centres receive program funding that ranges from 120,000 up to 485,000, but the majority are down around about that 120,000 mark. Total funding by neighbourhood centres into the neighbourhood centre program is around about 17 million. You'll see some figures that are in a lot of media releases from the department that are up around 19.5 million. And I'm fairly confident that's because those 19.5 million figures include the Community Connect Worker program, which is in 12 neighbourhood centre sites. So that's been running for about 4 years, roughly estimates to about 2.1 million or 2.2 million. But that's an additional program on top of regular neighbourhood centre funding. And we saw a CPI hasn't been as high as it was the year before. When we look at the governance structure of organisations, we see that 82% of neighbourhood centres are independent community-based organisations. Roughly 10%, 12 centres are run by a local council. That's particularly the case in very remote communities where there's not a lot of community infrastructure. And there's 10 centres that are run by larger non-profit organisations that would be national organisations. We also had a look at wage growth versus funding, and we actually originally had a look at some of this during our submission to the women's strategy to just have a look at what the pay levels were like for neighbourhood centres. We found overall that between the CPI increase for the SHADS award and the CPI increase for neighbourhood centre funding over the past 5 years, the centre funding hasn't kept up with the CPI for wage increases, and there's a shortfall of 2.1%. Majority of neighbourhood centre workers are part-time, 53%, and only 20% are full-time. And extrapolated amounts of staff members, 1,624 staff members that offer $1.4 million worth of working hours per year. Buildings, different types of building infrastructure that neighbourhood centres have and who they're owned by. This is important in that neighbourhood centre facilities that are owned by the Department of Communities or the local council, those organisations can often rent those facilities at a peppercorn rent rates, whereas the other, what have we got, 24% of neighbourhood centres there pay private rent rates, and that's not reflected in the funding amounts that are given to neighbourhood centres. So overall, we had a look at, added up, we calculated what we could calculate out of that. So the participant activities, we applied the Deloitte method that Victoria used on the number of participants that are in neighbourhood centres and the number of people that would have increased quality of life as a result of that. That came up to 31 million. Volunteer replacement value, we used a new calculation for that this year. We used Volunteering Queensland's calculation for volunteers within the age group of 55 to 65, because that's where we thought that roughly volunteers in neighbourhood centres would fit. Also calculated food value based on a social return on investment by Food Bank, which calculated their social return on investment for food at $20.05 per kilo of food. All the others are roughly just the market value for those things. The auspicing value, we calculated that based on the public liability insurance that those organisations would have to pay if they didn't have the support of the Neighbourhood Centre. And we found that overall, the community value that the Neighbourhood Centre sector was producing in Queensland, the calculable value was $90 million, which is a massive amount. And when you look at the community value on investment for that, and big drum roll, $4.81 for every dollar that the Queensland government is investing into the Neighbourhood Centre program. So that's an increase from $4.08 in our first survey. And that's pretty impressive when you take into account the COVID pandemic that the neighbourhood centres had to deal with. They're actually producing more community value than they were prior to COVID-19. And just to kind of end with, for all the neighbourhood centres that participate in the survey, that completed a survey, what we do is we give them their survey results, their data, and also an individual value report for their particular neighbourhood centre. And we'll do that in the next day or two. And so you can actually see that calculable breakdown for your particular neighbourhood centre in that. And we're running an impact report workshop in a couple of weeks' time, just so we can talk over that impact snapshot with the neighbourhood centres and talk about how that individual value report can be used by your centre for grant applications, for advocacy with your local MP, for annual reports, for working with other groups of neighbourhood centres. I know that there's one small group of neighbourhood centres in the southwest area of Queensland that actually have combined their value reports together and apply for grants together to get additional funding, and have had quite a bit of success in that area. So thanks for that. And I think, am I passing it back to Thomas or Em?
I think it's back to the group, actually. It's nice that it's actually a size of group that we're hopeful that we can actually now just have a pretty informal discussion. As you can tell, the team have spent a long time going really into that detail of really understanding and unpacking and making sure that there's a really good evidence base behind what we're saying, even as we know that that's still not calculating so much of the amazing value of neighbourhood centres. In a moment, we will drop the report launch, and that will happen with Thomas. But for now, we've actually got kind of between 5 to 10 minutes to really hear from you around, I guess, any insights or anything that surprised you about what you've just seen and heard, any further questions, an opportunity to ask for more clarification or how things might relate to your centre, or possibly just a comment around how some of this might relate to the work or ways that you've been thinking about your work in your community and how you've been kind of working at demonstrating that impact too, as we know. And also, probably we've missed the biggest thank you of all, which is to all the centres for really taking the time to do what is a very long survey. So that is probably first off the rank, is just saying a big thank you for making that time and effort. And we really hope that both the individual report and then this kind of collective advocacy that we're embarking on together, and really using the sector impact report as part of that kind of key campaign tool going forward. Miranda.
Hello. I've got a question about capturing data. I had the same question with the snapshot, so forgive me that I didn't reach out, but I'm always a little unclear when collecting this kind of data on if and how to capture the out of hours activities that happen as part of us renting our spaces out. So I'd just like to have a little kind of conversation about that. Does everyone capture it? Do you only capture the hirers that you work closely with or refer into, or are we capturing the ballet class using the hall on a Sunday morning that we've never even met the person who hosts it, kind of thing.
Yes. So there is a question on the survey of how many hours per week is your neighbourhood centre open? And that includes all of the premises. So it includes after hours activities. And I think that there's a calculation we can put against that on like the dollar value that the neighbourhood centre creates per hour the neighbourhood centre is open for.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I'd be including data on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Even when we're collecting data on the groups and activities and programs that happen here, would you report on those kind of private hire groups as well, that use community halls that get rented out and whatnot? Like, I would never capture a one-off person who might hire the space to have a birthday party. That's a no-brainer.
Yeah.
But we have a lot of 12-step programs that run out of here, and we tend to, obviously we share a lot of clients and stuff. So, I always tend to capture those, but then there's other programs that kind of fall in that iffy. I mean, they're using our space. There's coordination involved in having them here and whatnot, obviously, but it's just about whether or not to kind of report on them in the same way that you would the art class that is actually run as part of the neighbourhood centre, or to, yeah.
I guess what we're looking at is the amount of community value that's produced for that investment by neighbourhood centres, and probably it is a bit of a stretch to say that that particular neighbourhood centre is producing that amount of community value if another organisation is coming in and running it for you. But there is some recording of how many community groups are actually using the neighbourhood centre as well. It's just some of the limitations with the survey, I think.
Excellent. Thank you.
And thank you for asking that question, because we'll also think through for the design of the survey questions next year, maybe making it really kind of just making sure that we're being really clear around kind of community groups, which is everybody that you work with. If the neighbourhood centre and the space wasn't here, what would be the impact of that, as opposed to the work that yourselves as the neighbourhood centre team are working on? Yeah,
excellent. Thank you.
You see, I kind of still look at including those groups that do use, for example, like kids birthday parties or community groups using the facility as a party venue, simply because that's still accessing and engaging community. They're actually using our services, they're actually using our facilities. If it wasn't that, if they weren't doing that, they'll be going elsewhere. So I think it's about being quite broad in your thinking in terms of who actually accesses the centre. And some of those individuals, for example, like there is one instance where we had a family, they had a birthday party for one of their kids. They had about 20-30 kids come along, and out of that, about 2 or 3 families accessed our family support program. So there is that soft entry in some other services and programs, and I think that's really crucial to have. But we've got an Indian a Sikh group that are using our centre this weekend, and they've got about 70 people coming along. We actually help them become an auspiced group. So even though they've got no other sort of connection with us, but they're actually using the service, the centre, for that sort of capacity. So it's about who accesses it from community.
Yeah.
So.
And does the Sikh group offer emergency relief as well?
Not this. Oh yes, they do. They do.
Yeah.
Yeah. So no, that's good. Can I just also add, the stuff that you've got, the data that you provide is absolutely fantastic, and well done to you guys for collating and all that. I know it's a shitload of work that you did, putting it all together, transposing that sort of, collating it all, trying to make some sense out of it. But I think that's really, really good. It's that kind of hardcore data we really need when we're looking at sourcing funds, looking at advocacy staff, looking at lobbying staff, all that kind of sort of things. because I know our colleagues get quite surprised when we talk about data like that, you know. So it's really crucial, and I think, you know, if we do this consistently over a period of time, we can see some really marked changes. And I think the powers to be will realise eventually we do a hell of a lot of work, and there's a lot of bucks made in that too.
Thanks so much for that, Michael. On that note, it was even, for example, meeting with Minister Fentiman last week and being able to bring the data that centres have shared, which is, did you know that 38% of neighbourhood centres have domestic and family support services available? So again, that trying to bust neighbourhood centres out of, even though we're in this Department of Communities portfolio, we're actually delivering to all aspects of government, and being able to bring that information to each minister to be like, here's your portfolio, here's how neighbourhood centres are delivering outcomes for your portfolio. What will it take for you to support neighbourhood centres in the next budget?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So thank you for that data, because again, it's seeing those emerging themes and being able to really confidently talk to the value and the work that centres are doing, which is really fabulous.
I mean, even to see that the value of for every dollar invested, it's gone up, you know, from $4.08 to $4.81 in 12 months. I mean, that's fairly significant.
Yeah, and we could actually add upon that. There were some values that I chose not to include for things around social enterprises and figures like that. So it could, it's actually much higher than that, really.
Yep. Okay. Yep.
I'm enjoying this discussion. Do others have key things that they're thinking about, or, for example, Michael, how this might relate to your work and context, or Corey, or anyone else who wants to have a question or reflection?
Yeah, I was going to ask if I could. That I noticed there's a good increase in long-term food security. Might be a dumb question, but I'm just trying to understand exactly what that is. Could someone just put that in a bit more context?
That's not a dumb question. We've also been trying to, we also had that discussion. So I'll hand over to Chris to talk about what we learned.
Yeah. And I wondered how the survey respondents interpreted that question as well. But I know what we saw during COVID was not only people without food, but getting access to food, like with deliveries to supermarkets and that sort of thing, was very difficult. And so to be able to get access to food on an ongoing basis is the way that I interpret that long-term food security.
Yeah, look, I did the same too, Chris. That's how I interpret it. And the thing is, so for us, it was about food access, irrespective of where it came from. We had a lot of people who, particularly where we're situated, we had a lot of people during COVID, particularly at the beginning of COVID, a lot of the tourism and hospitality industries just shut their doors. And as a consequence there of people who had no funds or had lost their jobs, had no funds, and so therefore they needed to access food. And as it is, it's that recycling of food in terms of the cafes and restaurants that shut their doors gave their food to us so that we could then hand them out to their former employees to a degree. So it's that sort of stuff. The other factor too is in terms of food access and food security, there's a fairly large contingent of homeless people and new recently made homeless people that access food. They can't access food any other sort of way, or just food is just too expensive for them. So there's for us, it's a ready supply of fresh fruit and veg and meat, as well as frozen meals for that. So it's about that accessibility of food readily.
Thanks, Michael. So again, Alana's got your hand up.
I was just thinking before about, we were talking about it's nearly a conservative estimate, and there is some things that we think we might be providing impact with that can be hard to put the dollar value on. And I just wanted to note that I can already see the sophistication change of the survey from the first round to the next round. So I appreciate it's going to be a work in progress. My brain was thinking about the work we've been doing in the disaster recovery space at the moment and how we'll capture that for the next report. And even a lot of the referral and information we do, where we're getting people connected to services for early intervention, I'm not sure if there's was a spot for that, whereas I think that's some of our most impactful work. My thought is, and I don't know, Chris, if it would be something that can feed into the report itself, but a question to capture, do we think there's anything else we do that might have had a value? And we'll contribute that so that for future ones in the years to come, we can start thinking about ways to measure some of that extra stuff. My final observation is it would be so interesting to see how what we're capturing corresponds, if there's any correlation to the data we capture for the department about civic engagement and social connectivity, and what values they would assign to those things. But I just wanted to say I'm always happy to take the time to do this report, because even though it does take a little bit of time, I think the outcome at both the individual centre level, but also the collective advocacy is well worth it. And thanks for taking the lead on that, because I know it's a lot of work. Looks great.
Yeah. Thanks, Alana. And just on that note, that the report is only like the tip of the iceberg on the data that we've collected through that survey. We have just so much data sitting behind that. And that gives us some flexibility when the department or another stakeholder comes to us and says, well, how many neighbourhood centres are involved in digital inclusion for, and we need these statistics for our digital inclusion program that, the state's writing a policy about, or that another body wants to do a partnership with neighbourhood centres around, and we're able to have that versatility to be able to go to the data and then get that specific data and then feed it that information to whoever needs it.
And also demonstrating that expertise of the sector around, we should be funding the sector to do this work, and being able to demonstrate the role of neighbourhood centres as those connectors, as those social incubators, all of those different roles. So we've talked a lot about the quantitative data today, and this is a huge step. And I also want to give a shout out to Taylor and everybody who I think spoken to Taylor, most of you in this room, who's been collecting some more qualitative stories. So really looking at, as a sector, this really big strategy and push that we've been on with our members around both getting some hard numbers, and then also the stories that illustrate what's sitting behind those numbers, and also what can't be captured by those data. So hopefully next year, don't be too scared, Chris, we'll have the data, and we'll also have some more of those case studies and stories that really highlight and unpack what's sitting behind it, even as we're using those stories and data together going forward to try to say, if you're funding disaster resilience, then you need to be funding neighbourhood centres. If you're funding domestic and family violence outcomes, positive outcomes, then you need to be funding neighbourhood centres. So thanks again, everybody, for all your time in participating in the work, in answering the emails, in participating in the interviews, and all of this work that we're hoping really drives us forward together as a sector. And with no further ado, it is 1:16. So Thomas, you have 1 minute to officially launch the report, and then we'll, say goodbye.
Thanks all. I've just seen this report and the presentation for the first time, just like with everyone else. So just a couple of things I wanted to comment, just how good it looks. That again, the strength of the report is in the robustness of the data, and just how when we did the first annual survey, we pretty much had to ring people up and beg them to do the survey. They all said it was long and pointless, and what was the point? And I think after the first report came up, a few people went, this is cool, we can do something. And I think now the second time around, it was so much easier to encourage people to feel it and then to see the results. And I think, it's just so powerful. There was two things that I wanted to kind of comment that it was very interesting for me, and I don't know what to do with it, but I think it was worth to note. In the part where it talks about participation, and you have everything divvied up between metropolitan and then remote and regional, how the metropolitan, which is 10,000 or more people, I think it was something like 230 kind of participations per week. But when you go to the rural with less than 3,000, the number is not proportional. So actually for rural areas, proportional to population, you have way higher, more participation. And again, it highlights that once we have most of our members in rural areas and remote areas, how much more important they are to those communities. So how much we need to be supporting and promoting and highlighting that in all those communities, if they didn't have the neighborhood centre, it would be like critical to not have them, or to not keep funding and rolling a wider network of centres. So that was something interesting to kind of keep looking at. And then the other thing, which I think is very obvious, and we talk about it often, but again, it's highlighted with the numbers, is how much the centres just change and position themselves to what's currently happening and to what's local. And when we see those numbers around, great, the centres might have been closed and we weren't delivering as many groups, our service delivery increased in other areas. We didn't close the doors, we didn't shoo people away, we just found other ways to operate and to keep doing what we do in response. And I think, again, like, that's difficult to quantify, but it is in the numbers. You can read that story quite clearly, that we didn't just sort of like roll over and waited for the storm to pass. We just found ways to keep doing amazing work that was relevant and current. So again, stories are great, but the numbers are backing that up, that we can pivot and we can be very efficient with what we have. Those are my 2 comments. I see that the Melanie, you've already put the link. Honourable mention to Michael from Multilink, who I can see already printed the reports, and he's already reading the printed report. So well done, Michael. So I've declared this report launched. Let's go forth and promote it and tell everyone we know how amazing you all are in filling the form, in doing the work that you do. And Chris, Mel, Taylor, and the rest of the NCQ team who's not here, like, well done, this is amazing. And if we didn't have the peak body doing this work, we would never have time to do this, even for ourselves as small organizations. So it's so powerful to have the sector picture, and then that we're going to be able to get our own center. So thank you so much. It's amazing work.
Thanks so much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. We'll be in touch soon with the individual sector impact reports. Be excited. See you.